As we finished up on chapter 3, we were pretty well convinced by Bill that because of our insanity, that if we didn't find that power greater than human power, eventually we would probably return back to drinking. Now, being convinced of that still doesn't mean that we necessarily like it, nor does it necessarily mean that we feel we can have that spiritual experience. You know, many people come to the fellowship with preconceived ideas about God, spirituality, and various other different things. And it seems as though some of us were raised in a kind of background where we had a great fear regarding God. I know in my own particular situation, it seemed to me as though about the only thing I ever heard about God when I was a kid growing up was hellfire and damnation. That you go to hell for lying and cheating and stealing and drinking whiskey and committing adultery. And by the time I'd got to AA, I'd had about 26 years of that. And I knew that God had told St. Peter, when that little four-eyed sucker gets up there sending him downstairs, we won't need his kind. Now here suddenly I'm faced with the fact that I'm going to have a spiritual experience or else. And for many people like me, that would seem to be an absolute impossibility. And I think without maybe some new understanding of spirituality, maybe some new ideas regarding God, that many of us would have been stymied and could have gone no further. Even though we see the need for it, we would have felt it would be impossible to do so. And I've always got to remember that Bill Wilson was a real alcoholic. And he felt just about like most of us do. And I think he realized the need for this also. And he wrote us another chapter called We Agnostics. And in this chapter, he takes people like us who have been separated from God for a long period of time, gives us a few simple little ideas, and a simple little procedure that we can follow in order to be able to have this vital spiritual experience or find this power greater than human power. Kind of like a simple spiritual kindergarten, really. You know, most books I read regarding God tries to prove God to me. Bill doesn't do that at all, because it would be impossible for him to do so. What he has given us is a little outline, and if we will follow it, it will let God prove himself to us. And that's an entirely different concept as far as most spiritual writings are concerned. Let's look at this chapter with a few ideas of how we can get from the state of powerless to the state of one who can find that power. He said, in the preceding chapters you've learned something of alcoholism. We hope we've made clear the distinction between the alcoholic and the non-alcoholic. Again, we see the textbook idea. He's been teaching us as we've gone through these prior chapters about what alcoholism is and what it isn't. If when you honestly want to, you could find you cannot quit entirely, or if when drinking you have little control over the amount you take, you are probably alcoholic. And we just love the simplicity of the big book. Two simple little questions to determine whether we're alcoholic or not. Now, if you honestly want to, you find you cannot quit entirely, or if when drinking you have little control over the amount you take, then you're probably an alcoholic. And you see what people do to us and how people expand things. In our fellowship today, we have a pamphlet that has 44 questions in it to determine if you're alcoholic. You don't need but two. I'm glad Ibby didn't have the 44 questions when he walked in Bill's kitchen. Old Bill sitting there drunk, been drunk 3 weeks, hung over like hell. Ibby would have said, Bill, has alcohol been interfering with your reputation? Well, he hadn't had a reputation in years. And he always said, Bill, has alcohol been interfering with your sex life? And I'll bet you hadn't had any of that in years either. Now, he'd have confused the hell out of Bill. You know, even today I like to use these two questions. Somebody comes to me and they say, Charlie, do you think I might be alcoholic? I say, I don't know. Let me ask you a couple of questions. I say, have you been able to quit entirely on your own strength? And if they're a real alcoholic, they got to say no. And I say, do you have any control over the amount you take after you once start drinking? And if they're a real alcoholic, they got to say no. And I say, well, then you're probably an alcoholic. Now, if that be the case, you may be suffering from an illness, which only a spiritual experience will conquer. We number amongst a few people in the world today who have an illness of both the mind and the body that can only be overcome by spiritual experience. We are very unique people. And we got to thinking about this the other day. We also number amongst a few people in the world who have a terminal illness that we can come out of it in better shape than we were when we went into it, if we can have this spiritual experience. Now, to one who feels he's an atheist or an agnostic, such an experience seems impossible. But to continue as he is means disaster, especially if he's an alcoholic of the hopeless variety. To be doomed to an alcoholic death,
Step 1.
or to live on a spiritual basis,
Step 2.
are not always easy alternatives to face. But it isn't so difficult. About half our original fellowship were of exactly that type. At first, some of us tried to avoid the issue, hoping against hope we were not true alcoholics. But after a while, we had to face the fact that we must find a spiritual basis of life or else. Perhaps it's going to be that way with you. But cheer up, something like a half of us thought we were atheists or agnostics, and our experience shows that you need not be disconcerted. Doesn't make any difference whether we're atheists or whether we're agnostic or whatever we are. We're still going to be able to have this spiritual experience. Now, if a mere code of morals or a better philosophy of life were sufficient to overcome alcoholism, many of us would have recovered long ago. Now, we alcoholics are not drunken bums. A drunken bum's about what they want to be, where they want to be, and they're doing about what they want to do, and they're really not too interested in changing the situation. But I've never met an alcoholic yet that didn't have a code of morals and a philosophy of life. We're usually with the drunken bum, but we don't want to be there. The problem is, because of our alcoholism, we can't live up to our codes and our philosophies, but if they would have saved us, we would have recovered a long time ago. We found that such codes and philosophies did not save us, no matter how much we tried. We could wish to be moral. We could wish to be philosophically comforted. In fact, we could will these things with all our might, but the needed power wasn't there. Our human resources, as marshaled by the will, were not sufficient. They failed utterly. And I believe that to be 100% true. Because if mine and your human resources, as marshaled by our will, if that had succeeded in our alcoholism, we wouldn't be members of AA today. We came to AA only because we had to. This is the court of last resort. We've tried in most cases everything else, and AA is about the last thing that we try. I've never seen anybody come to AA because they wanted to. I've never seen anybody that said I took a drink when I was 14 years old, jumped up and down and shouted with joy and said, I can hardly wait to be a member of AA when I'm 28 years old. If we could have found the answer any other way, we would have not been members of AA. Lack of power. That was our dilemma. We had to find a power by which we could live. And it had to be a power greater than ourselves, obviously. But where and how were we to find that power? Well, that's exactly what this book is about. Its main object is to enable you to find a power greater than yourself which will solve your problem. Now, it doesn't say which will help you solve it or enable you to solve it. It said which will solve your problem. So those of us who are powerless, whether we be atheist or agnostic, whatever our morals and philosophies of life are, however intelligent we may have been, we were never able to find that power to overcome our disease. So our real problem becomes, whatever we are, still a lack of power. Now, if we can find the power, then the power will solve the problem. And interestingly enough, from page 45 on, this book does not deal with alcohol anymore. It deals with one thing and one thing only. How do you find the power? And those of us who are powerless, if we can find the power, then the power will solve the problem. And it's going to start giving me a simple little procedure to do this with. Joe?
Okay. As Charlie said, what this chapter does, it gives us a simple procedure, which if anyone follows this procedure, then we will find the power, and the power will solve the problem. This all begins on page 47, how we begin this procedure. We need to ask ourselves with one short question. Do I now believe, or am I willing to believe, that there is a power greater than myself? I remember we got two people here who are having problems. The one who's found the power don't have no problem. I mean, he's living pretty good. And if you don't have this problem, then there could be two positions we could be in. One position is a agnostic. Agnostic, well, he's a person that believes in God, but he's waiting for faith before he gets started, you know. And basically, when he realizes it, he already believes. Do I now believe? Well, the agnostic already believes, so he's ready to begin. The atheist has to become willing to believe. Either one of these people can begin if they can believe, or if the atheist becomes willing to believe, both of them will be, then they're ready to go. As soon as a man can say he does believe, or is willing to believe, we emphatically show him he's on his way. It has been repeatedly proven among this simple cornerstone a wonderfully effective spiritual structure can be built. Believe, all we have to do with this, this procedure to find God is to believe. And if we examine ourselves, if we're agnostic, I always did believe in God, but I acted as if I didn't. Atheists don't believe in it. He can't use it at all. But I believed in it and didn't use it. So I was agnostic. So believing is the beginning. It's the beginning of, that's not this only in finding God. Believing is the beginning of anything that we do. That's the way we begin to get up out of the chair we sat in. We believe we can get up. Everything begins with believing. It's a state of the mind before we do something. And it's our future. It's our lives begin in that. Our failure and our success. It's very, very important what we believe. Because whatever we believe, we're going to become. And this is the way we learn to do anything in life, is to believe. Now, the biggest thing with me is I thought in order to use God, you had to have faith. But it maybe somewhere else, but here in AA, all we have to do in AA to begin is to believe. And there's a lot of difference between belief and faith. See, belief comes before you do something. Faith comes after you do it. And it's hard to have faith up front. It's really hard to have faith in God up front, or faith in anything. See, if I just moved here new in town and I didn't know anybody here in town, I had some trouble with my car. Chances I would ask somebody that lives here, y'all know anybody around here that's a good mechanic? And one of you might tell me, well, old John down there on so-and-so on the corner, he's a real good mechanic. So he'll do you a good job, and he'll charge you a reasonable price. Well, I don't have any faith in John, but I might believe you. And if I believe you, I can carry my car down there, and he does some work on my car, and he does a great job on it. When I get my car back and it runs good, then I got faith in him. Now, when my car has some more trouble, I go back on faith. But the first time, you have to start off by believing. Believing is the beginning. And that's all we have to do. And most of us, our trouble is we're waiting on faith. We don't realize we already, that's all we can start right now. If you believe or become willing to believe, that's good enough to get started. You do not have to have faith in God to get started.
Step 2 says we came to believe that a power greater than ourselves can restore us to sanity. It does not say we came to know. Belief is upfront information. Belief is suspicion. Faith is after the fact information. Faith is knowledge. And the book says that was great news for us. For we had assumed we could not make use of spiritual principles unless we accepted many things on faith which seemed difficult to believe. That was always my problem in church. The minister always said, son, all you got to do is have faith and everything will be all right. Hell, I could hardly have faith. I could just barely believe, much less have faith. So it's nice for me to know that I don't have to know anything. I've just got to believe that there is a power greater than myself. As an agnostic, I've always believed. If I'm an atheist, I can become willing to believe. Now, Bill said it's been repeatedly proven among us that upon this simple cornerstone, a wonderfully effective spiritual structure can be built. Asterisk, bottom of the page, please be sure to read Appendix 2 on spiritual experience. This is our third reference to Appendix 2. This time he's referring to it with the statement, a wonderfully effective spiritual structure can be built. Now this guy loves to paint pictures in your mind with words. He is in the process of painting a spiritual structure in our mind through which we're going to pass to freedom. And a little later on he's going to tell us what it is. But this is really his second reference to it already. Back in his story, he referred to willingness as being the foundation of a structure. Here he's referring to belief as being the cornerstone of this structure. Later on we're going to see the keystone, and we're going to see other stones go in place, and he's going to draw that structure in our mind. And using it in reference to the wonderfully effective spiritual structure, referring it to the spiritual experience, what he's really talking about is we're building this spiritual experience as we process through the book. We already are in the process of change. If we can say we believe, or we are willing to believe, that it is a power greater than ourselves can restore us to sanity. That's how simple the beginning of this thing really is. Let's go over to page 51. Let's look at an idea of what we can develop based on belief only. What we can do with the power of just believing, not knowing, but believing. This world of ours has made more material progress in the last century than in all the millenniums which went before. Almost everyone knows the reason. Well, I don't think we do. And everything you and I use today in the material world, we've developed it within the last 100 years. And I always thought the reason for that is people that lived 1,000 years ago were dumb. They were not as smart as we are. But this thing says students of ancient history tell us that the intellect of men in those days was equal to the best of today. They were just as smart then as they are today, yet they developed none of those things. The spirit of modern scientific inquiry, research, and invention was almost unknown. In the realm of the material, men's minds were fettered by superstition, tradition, and all sorts of fixed ideas. Now, the reason they didn't invent the things 1,000 years ago that we have today is because they were not allowed to believe differently. Superstition kept their minds fixed. Tradition, fixed ideas, kept them from developing anything new because they didn't believe they could. Now, if you lived 1,000 years ago and you dared to believe differently, look out. You better keep it to yourself. Because if you go around spouting off those new beliefs you got, somebody's going to get you in trouble and real fast. And it wasn't too many years ago we were burning people at the stake here in the United States because they dared to believe differently. We called them witches. Can you just see somebody 1,000 years ago walking down the road, got a box with a hole cut in the front of it, wires hanging out of it? Somebody said, "What do you got there?" He says, "Well, I've got a television set." "Television set? What's that?" "Well, I'm going to take this home and I'm going to plug it in, and I'm going to see pictures and get words from clear on the other side." Hell, they would have killed him before he got home. The reason they never invented anything new is because they were not allowed to believe differently. In the last 100 years, superstition, tradition, and fixed ideas have gone out the door. Our minds have been released to change our belief. And the reason we got somebody or had somebody on the moon is because somebody was allowed to believe we could do that. The reason we have microwave ovens is because somebody believed they could make a microwave oven. The reason we have powered aircraft is because somebody believed that they could do that. Nobody knew they could do it. They could only believe in the beginning. And if you're going to change the status of anything, the only thing you can possibly do in the beginning is to believe you can do so. Not know, but to believe. Some of the contemporaries of Columbus thought a round earth was preposterous. Let's go back now about 500 years ago. I think it'll be 500 years in 1992. Practically all of the civilized world as we knew it at that time was around the shores of the Mediterranean Ocean and on the western shores of Europe. They had found a place that they called the East Indies. And in the East Indies they found gold, silk, spices, and lots of goody-goodies. And they wanted to get those things and get them back fast so they could use them. Now the only way they had to go, though, was to sail by ship to the east end of the Mediterranean Sea, then go by land literally thousands of miles, camelback, horseback, footback, however they went, and pick that stuff up and then return it back, and it took literally years to make that trip. And circumstances caused them to begin looking for a new trade route to the East Indies. And somebody said, is there any way that you could go there by ship? And they said, why no, idiot. Said, if you tried to go by ship, you sail to the east end of the Mediterranean, you run into the land, you got to go on. They said, well, could you do it by going the other way? And they said, oh no. If you sail out that way, you're going to sail right off the edge of this sucker, and you're not ever going to come back. Now, everybody believed 500 years ago that the world was flat. Now, I don't really know why they believed that, except I guess some of them sailed out there and didn't come back, so they assumed they sailed off the edge of it. Joe said the other day, wouldn't it be great if the world was flat? We could take all this environmental junk we're worrying about and just take it out there and shove it right off the edge of it and get rid of it. Now, Columbus comes along 500 years ago, and we earnestly believe that we ought to have a Columbus Day in AA. This guy had to be alcoholic. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. You got to be tough, you got to be stubborn, to be willing to stand there in the face of everybody else's belief and express a belief which is entirely different. Columbus said, I do not think this thing is flat, I think it is round. And then he made one of the most drunk statements the world's ever heard. He said, I believe that we could get east by sailing west. Now, if that's not alcoholic thinking, I don't know what is. 4 or 5 other things occurred that make us believe he was alcoholic. First, when he left, he didn't know where he was going. When he got there, he didn't know where he was. When he came back, he didn't know where he had been. But what really made him alcoholic is that a woman financed the whole trip, every bit of it.
This guy, he was definitely an alcoholic, though. I really believe that. I laughed with Charlie. I said, who else could stand in the West Indies and think he was in the East Indies? But he really, he changed the world with this simple principle. See, the whole world believed the world was flat. In order to make the change, Columbus had to believe it was round. And he had to believe against everybody else. He had to believe different to change. Because if you believe the same, you remain the same. The only way to change is to believe different. Sometimes it's pretty hard to believe different.